Welcome to the Political Dispatch. In this special two-part episode, we dive into the recently concluded French elections with Dr. Charles Devellennes, a senior lecturer in political and social thought at University of Kent. He specializes in political theory and French politics and is the author of the books The Macron Regime and The Gilets Jaunes and the New Social Contract.
The recent parliamentary elections resulted in a significant shift within the French National Assembly. Macron's alliance, Ensemble les Citoyens, lost its outright majority, and the far-left alliance, Nouveau Front Populaire, gained the most seats, leading to a more fragmented and challenging political landscape. This outcome has crucial implications for Macron's legislative agenda and the balance of power in French politics.
Part 1 will uncover the man behind the presidency. Who is Emmanuel Macron? We'll explore how his first term in office differs from his second, examine his relationship with the media, and break down the intricacies of the French electoral system. We'll also discuss the context and the outcomes of the recent elections, highlighting key moments and turning points that defined the race.
In Part 2, we'll look at the broader political landscape of France. Dr. Devellennes will explain how the Fifth Republic is designed, the future role of the National Rally in French politics, and Macron's economic vision for the country. We'll also discuss what French philosophers might think of modern France and what the recent election results mean for the UK and the EU.
Stay tuned for an in-depth analysis of one of the most pivotal elections in Europe.
So my name is Charles Devellennes. I'm a senior lecturer in political and social thought at the University of Kent. And I work on a variety of different fields, but mostly political theory, but also French politics. And recently I've written 2 books on French politics, one on the Yellow Vests called The Gilets Jaunes and the New Social Contract. And then in 2022, the Macron Regime, which is kind of self-explanatory. A book on Macron's first term in office, really. And now we're almost 2 years past that book, and not much has changed, really. I mean, a lot of news pieces, but the analysis remains quite up to date, I would say. So I work on ideology. I work on social movements, and I'm very interested in using very complex philosophical ideas and making them more accessible and more up-to-date, and how to understand contemporary phenomena using those kind of complex ideas. What does it mean to have a kind of security nexus with Foucault when we look at contemporary France? So that's the kind of stuff that I'm interested in and that I write about.
Amazing, thank you. Thanks for your time. And that's interesting to have that piece where you're looking at the everyday, or I think this is stuff that we talked about when I was at Kent, is that when someone says, well, I'm not interested in politics, but it has an interest in you, it's sort of this whole thing that everything's political. So, and there's a bit more depth behind the things that are going on as well. So there's a few topics that I want to cover off today, looking at the most recent French elections, looking at the sort of the political, social, economic, and indeed sort of philosophical debates that are going on in the country. But first of all, I do want to talk about President Macron. It's not very original, but and who he is, really, from your readings that you've done and the things that you've talked about in your work. Who is President Macron? How did he become president, and what is his ideology, if there is any?
Yeah, that's a good question, and a normal one, because we're all interested in who this person is. So Macron is not really a typical politician in France. I think that's the first thing to note, is that there was an unspoken rule in French politics before Macron that you needed to have taken part in local politics before you do national politics. So most politicians would have been elected as a mayor, or they would have been a councillor at the departmental level. So the départements in France are the kind of lowest unit of administration after the mayors. and or they would have been a regional councillor or something along those lines, or maybe even a member of parliament or something like that. This wasn't the case for Macron. So Macron was a sort of brilliant student. He graduated from all the top schools of France, all the elite schools. So we're talking about Sciences Po Paris, so the political science school in the capital, and l'ENA, which is the school founded by Charles de Gaulle in order to create a new administration for the Republic after the war. It's the most elite of schools. At the time, it used to take about 80 graduates per year. So you're talking for the whole of France, 80 people going to this school. It's a competitive exam to get in, very selective. And of course, Macron, being brilliant, had entered this top administration. So he had the formal training, but he didn't follow the formal democratic route, right? So it enabled him to kind of claim that he's an outsider in French politics because he hadn't really been involved in a political party. He was appointed in 2014 as Minister for the Economy by François Hollande, who was then president, because ministers are appointed in France. They don't need to have been elected. They don't need to be members of parliament, unlike in the UK. So he was appointed, but that was his first kind of political role. He had worked with Hollande before and was involved in the Socialist Party, but he was never involved in the day-to-day organization and running of the party or anything like that. So he's not involved in what we call these intermediary bodies, right, in French politics, like political parties or trade unions or other bodies like that. So he's an insider-outsider, always kind of inside but outside, on the margins, but being appointed at the top. He did a stint as an investment banker. So he made deals, one very famous one with Nestle and Pfizer. He arranged for a kind of big international deal, and he made a lot of money from that, right? From that deal in particular. He made partner before other people, so he clearly kind of was the most brilliant young banker at the bank, and then used that success in order to come back to politics and become Minister for the Economy. So it was thought to be a kind of, okay, maybe slightly, on the kind of on the left, but only nominally speaking. This was a very pro-business administration, Hollande's administration, with a lot of ministers that are only barely on the left of the political spectrum, much more on the center. Some may say even center-right for some of these ministers. And Macron was one of those, right? He was one of those very kind of pro-business socialists. There are some really embarrassing clips of him saying, "I am a socialist," and then a year later saying, "No, I was never a socialist." And so there's that kind of like double nature, also in and out of the Socialist Party, just like he was in and out of the kind of elites of French society. So that's kind of Macron in a nutshell. I don't know if you want more details. I mean, there's plenty of like juicy stories that there are out there in the literature on Macron. I've never met him or interviewed him, so I only read about him in the same sources that you have access to. But yeah, so maybe just to say something about his ideology is that he's very much a kind of a liberal, right? It's very straightforwardly, he's a liberal. In France, it's a very dirty word, liberal. In fact, in French, we don't really make the difference between liberal and neoliberal. We kind of use them as synonymous to one another. It's thought to be a very Anglo-Saxon ideology. Of course, this isn't true. I mean, there are plenty of French liberals, but they would never call themselves liberals. And Macron doesn't either. So he's very free market. He's very pro-business. He believes in trickle-down economics. All the kinds of tenets of liberalism economically, but I would say also maybe socially. He's socially liberal. He's not particularly conservative, though there's been a bit of an evolution there. So maybe we can discuss that kind of trajectory from early Macron to Macron today, in that some of his more socially liberal policies that were definitely there at the beginning have slowly shifted. But on the economic side, he was always kind of free market, very much to the center right of the political spectrum, I would say, by French standards.
it's really useful to have that background. But then also, the next question is actually about how does his first term as president differ to this second term? Obviously, you know, we're not fully through his second stint as president, and he's quite unusual in the fact that he was able to win a second term. What was it like him coming in as president first time round, and then what's that evolution look like? What are the are there any key moments in his journey?
Yeah, so in 2016, so just before he was elected, he announced that he was running, and it kind of everyone laughed at him. Everyone thought, who's going to make it? He's never run for office. Who's going to vote for this kind of centrist pretender to the throne of the elected monarchy that is the French Fifth Republic? So not many people believed in him, but some people who were very influential did, right, and backed him up. So he had enough support. He had used his time as a minister for the economy, so that's the equivalent of the chancellor of the exchequer in the UK. He had used this time to network, and so there are amazing stories of how he would run 2 dinners at his official residence of the minister per night. Right, so there would be a first shift and then a second shift, so that he could see more people in one night. And there was apparently even an unofficial third shift at La Rotonde. La Rotonde is like a famous brasserie in Paris, and he really likes this place apparently. And so they would hold these third shifts at La Rotonde after that. So imagine eating 3 times a night for networking. So that was that's the story of just how hard he was working to build his network. So he was clearly very ambitious, and he had it in mind that he was going to run at some point. And then he decided to run in 2017, and that was very, very lucky for him. So, you know, Machiavelli says that in order to seize power, you need both virtue and fortune, right? You need both skill and luck. And Macron got both, right? He had the skills for sure, but he also had the luck. He had the luck that in 2017, the candidate for the right had a huge scandal surface during the election campaign. So Fillon, who was a leader of the sort of French conservatives, turns out that he had given a job to his wife, Penelope, who's actually English. She's originally English, and it led to this scandal of Penelope Gate, we called it in French. And this Penelope Gate meant that actually a lot of votes were transferred to Macron, because it was thought that, he's not going to win, right? It's too toxic. His candidacy is too toxic. Combined with the fact that François Hollande didn't dare to run for a second term, his popularity was so bad that he didn't even run. So, and he was replaced by a kind of much more to the left person within the Socialist Party, Benoît Hamon, who had a program of very wide redistribution and a little bit of like a French Corbyn, if you like. And so there was this scare that among socialists even that he was too radical. And so a lot of the socialist electorate and the Republican electorate went to Macron. So he managed to get people from both sides. And so he did kind of deliver, at least electorally, on this promise of centrism, right? A lot of his support came from the 2 big parties of power in France since the 1950s, so the Socialists and the Republicans. And that capacity to bring those 2 blocs together in the center was really quite impressive. And that was his luck. His luck is that those 2 blocs were collapsing, and he managed to capitalize on this collapse of the 2 traditional blocks of power. And so he was lucky enough to be able to be elected in the first place, and immediately started what we would call neoliberal reforms, right? So he abolished the tax on wealth, which was a tax on the richest 1% in French society. It wasn't a particularly heavy tax. It was only, I think, 1% of real estate per year. So not a heavy tax, but nonetheless something you needed to pay if you. I think it only covered an estate over 1.3 million euros. So you had some margin basically before you reach that kind of money. And he immediately introduced a flat tax on dividends, which most people don't receive income or significant income from dividends, right? So introducing a flat tax is really it's a big gift to large shareholders in France because immediately they have to pay much less in terms of what they get out of, which is not work, right? It's an income from capital. And so his two first measures were conceived of and immediately attacked as gifts to the very rich in French society. And so he was immediately labeled as the president of the rich, right? So we're talking 2017. So I know the British media in particular and the American media also took a long time to catch up to that reality. But for French people, it was immediately clear what was happening, right? That Macron was to the right economically, very much so, and that he was going to do fiscal exemptions for the very rich in French society. That we're talking really not even the top half, right, but the top 1%. So this was became clear in the very first year of his presidency, and then the second year of the presidency we have the yellow vest. All right. So if we remember back to this kind of social movement that started in 2018 and lasted for about a year and a half until COVID, basically, this social movement reacted to a kind of new tax that was being introduced by Macron on fuel efficiency, on fuel, and with the idea that it was going to drive efficiency and growth, but really it affected people living in the countryside, right? Because when you go to France, and you told me you've been to France recently. If you go to France, like a lot of people, they would go to Paris or they would go to Bordeaux or Marseille, the big cities, for example, that have good public transport. But if you go to the countryside, so places where my parents live in the Lot, there is no public transport. Right? If you don't have a car, you do nothing. Right? So you need the car to bring your children to school, to go grocery shopping, to go to the mairie to do your kind of paperwork. So everything requires a car, and a tax on fuel was immediately perceived by people who live on the periphery of the big cities as an attack on them. Right? That you just did a huge gift for the very rich in French society, and then you tax us. And we can't afford to buy an electric car because we just don't have that kind of money. So essentially, this means, we're going to have to pay the price for your tax breaks to the rich. And they started this huge social movements, very popular at the beginning, lots of support from the French population. That support declined, obviously, over time. And it led to a lot of fighting among the big cities. Like in Paris, for example, there were scenes of riots and burning cars and etc. But really, the movement wasn't that at all. The movement, if you look at it much more widely, was a really bottom-up social movements where people gathered on roundabouts outside the cities, and they had kind of mini citizens' assemblies. So they got together and they did, what we used to do in, like in the open forum back in the day at the University of Kent. When we had, just open discussion. Anyone comes that morning, it was on Saturday mornings, you come on a Saturday morning, you bring a croissant or you bring a box of croissant for everyone around you, someone's brought some coffee, and you talk about politics and what's going on and what's wrong and what are your worries and your fears and what you think can be done about it. And that was a really beautiful moment in French social movements of solidarity and of thinking about the future. And they came up with a list of suggestions that are actually really interesting and really well thought through. But of course, they were immediately dismissed by the wider establishment as violent and creating chaos, when actually it was them asking for more participation in democracy. And I think at the bottom of that, there's a much wider question. Maybe we don't have time to go into it now, but the wider question is, what's wrong with French democracy today? I think there are many things that are wrong in French democracy, and the Yellow Vest captured part of that. Right? So that was only his second year in office, like 2018. He had just started his second year in office, and that happened. And then, of course, we had COVID. So, COVID was kind of a period of exception, as it was in the UK, lockdowns and restrictions on civil liberties and all of that, and massive spending of the state. So, the public debt went up during that time. And we had barely emerged from that by the time the 2022 election happened. So when he ran for his second term. And then he won again because he faced the far right in the second round of the election. So France has a 2-round election system for the presidency. It means the top 2 candidates actually make it to the second round. And in the second round, he was facing Marine Le Pen, who is the leader of the Rassemblement National. By then, it changed its name in 2018. Before that, it was the Front National. So the leader of the far right, and Macron was re-elected, but with a much thinner margin. Right? So he had, I think, 59% in the second round of the second election. So that's not as big as it used to be. By comparison, when Jacques Chirac faced Le Pen, the father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, back in 2002, he had 82%. Right? So we've gone from 82% in 2002 to 20 years later, 59%. Right? So the margin is much thinner now than it was. And so he got reelected, and he got reelected thanks to voters on the left, essentially, right? Because a lot of people who voted for the Socialists or the Greens or La France Insoumise, which is a kind of more radical left-wing party in France, they transferred their votes, a lot of them, to Emmanuel Macron, even though they hadn't voted for him in the first time. And so he got reelected with their votes, and then immediately in the second term went to continue his neoliberal reforms. All right, so there's a pensions reform. We can talk a little bit about that if you're interested. But one thing that always strikes me about the pensions reform is that the headline is, French people don't want to work until 64 years old. They want to keep it at 62. But that wasn't the main part of the reform. The reform was much, much wider than just the age at which you retire. It was a structural reform of French pensions, and it was clearly done against workers' interests, right? And it was immediately perceived by French people as such, that it was essentially favoring people who are already retired, who largely vote for Macron already, so his core electorate of retired, quite wealthy individuals. And it was favoring employers over employees. So employees lost out in a struggle against their employers there. And so their conditions of work became worse. And that was a large part of what was wrong with the reform, rather than the kind of headline that, they'll retire at 64. Oh, how terrible. Most people retire much later. But, it's easy to grab that on the headlines of newspapers, and much harder to talk through the kind of the details of pensions reform, because pensions are so boring. So the moral here is that really Macron has stayed really true to himself, right? In that he started off by, when he was a minister under Hollande, by doing neoliberal reform. We still call it the Macron law, which was a revision of employment contracts. And he continued that throughout his presidency, first and the first 2 years of his second term. Now, maybe it's hit a bit of an obstacle now with the latest election. Maybe he won't be able to continue. But at least for 7 years, this is what we've had. Very wide-ranging reforms of the state, of the welfare state, and turning towards a much more kind of, actually much more Anglo-Saxon, the French would call it, so, British American version of capitalism, much less concerned with the kind of the rights of workers than the previous version in France was. And these are not very well liked by people in France, even people who are more to the center right, and who value this old model of having a slightly more generous welfare state.
I'm just thinking now, because the examples you've given, And I can think about the discussion that was going on in the British press around pensions and age, and going, the French don't want to work any longer, and, you know, they should be more realistic because it's British people grumbling about the length of time that we have to retire, and perhaps the retirement age in France is a more realistic and generous offer. It's the interesting thing of what, you know, how the press and the media are representing France and the reality. There's two questions really. If Macron had been more embedded in the political system, do you think he would have made the same decisions, or do you think he would have taken a different tact? And what is his relationship with the media? Were they quick to turn on him as the general public were, in terms of him getting a lot of the support of the left, and then obviously fulfilling policies that were very different to that?
Yeah, so two very interesting questions. So yeah, let's take them in order. So would Macron have acted differently if he had been more embedded in the French political class? Well, yes, most definitely, in that there was a tradition of negotiating with intermediary bodies, and that includes the trade unions, obviously, not just political parties. And trade unions, you know, have a pretty bad reputation in France, especially when you look at it from the outside. You know, when you're visiting France and suddenly the trains are on strike, you know, that's definitely very disruptive. But what a couple of things to note about French trade unions is that there are actually very few French workers are members of trade unions. This is very surprising for people when they hear it, but it's a much lower figure than in the UK, for example. So in the UK, you're at around 20% of workers who are unionized. And in France, it's closer to between 8 and 11%, depending on how you count. So that figure is very low, but of course, they're quite active. So when a trade union calls for a strike, if you're a member, you go out on strike, which is not the case in the UK. I mean, I've seen it in my own union here in the UK, is that you know, turnout at strike is very low, whereas in France it would be extremely high. So not many people are unionized, but they're very active, the ones who are unionized. So that's the first thing to note. But also is that the unions, we often hear about the most radical unions, like the CGT. It used to be the union with the Communist Party, you know, back in the day. It still exists today. It's no longer affiliated with the Communist Party, but it's definitely one of the more radical unions out there. And but that's not even the majority of the unions. The majority of the unions are actually pretty middle of the road in France. So you do have some more kind of middle of the road unions, and typically those are consulted for reforms, and they work around the margins with the government in order to make the reforms happen, but lessen the impact on the workers, right? So they defend some of the core interests of the workers, but they usually don't go out on like all-out strike. And Macron angered those, right? So of course he was going to anger the CGT and the more radical unions. That's a given. But he also angered the moderate unions because he didn't listen to what they were suggesting. And so that was one of the ways in which he would have acted very differently had he been more embedded into the French political class. So yes, I think there's a very big big role that Macron played here. You know, the president, of course, shouldn't be involved in those decisions. These are usually taken by the government, so prime minister or the relevant ministers. But in practice, Macron was still omnipresent. He was everywhere. He was always here making the decisions. So he was there all the time, but he had no interest in those kind of intermediary bodies. For him, it was a kind of direct decision between the president and the people, right? And it's a very dangerous form of politics in France. It reminds us of the way that Napoleon ruled France. So this kind of Napoleonic tradition of having a direct link between the ruler and the people. That's a little bit how he operates. He doesn't have some of the other qualities that someone like Napoleon may have had, however. Let's not push the comparison too far, but at least that direct link between him and the people is a feature of the kind of Bonapartist France, as we'd call it. And de Gaulle, to a large extent, who created the Fifth Republic, had had that in mind, and so the Fifth Republic is kind of created on that basis. So that's the first question. Really, I think yes, it would have been different. For your second question about his relationship to the media, I think I'm not an expert on media, and I kind of wish I had someone working with me on this, because I think it's a really interesting question. In that the media landscape in France has changed a lot over the past decade or so. So there has been the introduction of these kind of 24-hour news channels in France during this period. I forget the exact dates, but so BFM TV is like it's one of those 24 hours news network, and it's controlled by billionaires, right? So the French press is largely controlled by a few people, few individuals who are billionaires and are sinking money into these media in order to control them. And so there's BFM that I just cited, but even you look at the major French newspapers, are almost all of them owned by billionaires. So it's a very strange situation where we've had a rising control of a very few select individuals over the French political media landscape, and some of them clearly deciding that this is our guy and he's gonna defend our interests. So we are going to support him. So one very clear example would be Bernard Arnault. So Bernard Arnault is the richest person in France. He's the boss of Louis Vuitton and other kind of brands like that. LVMH is the group that he presides over, and he runs this newspaper called Les Echos. And in Les Echos, there's a very pro-Macron line. Bernard Arnault personally wrote an op-ed in his own newspaper saying why I would vote for Emmanuel Macron, et cetera, et cetera. So, it's not even hidden, right? It's very kind of obvious and in your face, kind of backing up of the president. So the relationship with the media, I think, is absolutely fascinating and hugely important. And the media is very, very hostile to any kind of left-wing politics. So even newspapers, I would say, that were more kind of center-left up until a few years ago, or even newspapers like Le Monde, for example, that was widely conceived as a kind of center-left paper and backed socialists in the past, has been very hostile to left-wing movements in France, like La France Insoumise, for example. So there's not only just the ones that I cited, but even on the center left of the political spectrum, there's been a very, very strong reaction to the left and a kind of demonization of the left, while at the same time there's been a de-demonization, a kind of a normalization of the far right and of all the themes that the far right holds dear. So there are people who research this and detail this. I'm thinking of Aurélien Mondon, who is at the University of Bath. He's working on this kind of the mainstreaming of the far right in France. It's very well documented. So the media has been extremely tricky, very kind of happy to promote far right themes, very much in backing of Emmanuel Macron, and very critical of the left. So this kind of mechanic of the media in France has been extremely, extremely favorable to an environment where the far right is rising, but is still considered to be an unacceptable option by many. So the far right manages to come second in presidential elections, and ultimately voters on the left are faced with someone who clearly is on the center right or someone who clearly is on the far right. And so they go for the center-right figure. And this is a sure way for Macron to get reelected, because essentially he never has to campaign on ideas, because it's taken for granted that his ideas are better than those of the far right. So I hope that answers some of your questions, but I'd really be interested to hear more kind of in-depth media analysis, because it's not my main field of expertise.
I mean, that's fascinating, because I guess it's sort of Macron trying to hardwire change French belief systems. If you talk about the media environment there, having very supportive billionaire class, supporting him, which when we look at the United States, there's lots of millionaire and billionaire donors telling Joe Biden to step aside. So, you know, it's democracy run by the rich. So that's all really fascinating. And again, it's stuff that we don't really hear that much about in great depth over in the UK, because I suppose it's the centre of our gravity is our relationship with the United States, especially since Brexit. And there's probably a bit of inbuilt snobbery, particularly from the English, towards how European politics is presented in France. You did mention a bit about the 2 rounds and the voting system, and for the presidential, that means that 2 candidates will get through to the second round. In terms of the parliamentary elections, how is it different? Because I think a lot of people were confused by the fact that French folks were voting twice.
Yeah, so the French electoral system is actually quite close to the British one, with one major difference. So we also have a plurality system, like the UK. So we have in France 577 constituencies, and so you vote within your constituency. So that is the same as in the UK, kind of single member districts, right? So that's the plurality system. And it tends to favor a smaller number of political parties, like in the UK, usually 2 political parties, because you don't really need 50% of the vote to win, right? You just need to beat whoever is second. But in France, the difference is that there's a second round. So imagine the first round is about the same. You vote in your constituency, but then you are called in to vote for either the first 2 or first 3 candidates that from the first round, for a kind of face-off at the end. And I say 2 or 3 because there's a kind of complicated rule depending on turnout. So it's a percentage of the overall number of registered voters as opposed to the people who actually went to vote. So often there's the third candidate doesn't meet the thresholds. Right, but in this election, because there was a very high turnout compared with 2022, then a lot of third candidates met the threshold. And also because France is now much more divided into 3 blocks. So it was kind of a contest of who would come out on top in each district of 577 districts. And that's also why the polls got it wrong. Right? I mean, all the polls were suggesting that the far right, the RN, would come out on top. Some polls even suggested they'd get an absolute majority, so over 289 seats. Now they came very, very short of that, but it's very hard to predict because essentially what you have to do is 577 different polls. Right? It's not one poll, so you publish one polling thing saying, oh, I think it's going to turn out that way. But really, these are 577 different elections. So you have to follow each one individually. Some are much clearer than others. And a few were over in the first round, because if you get over 50% in the first round, you can be elected in the first round. There was a second round, and with 3 candidates going through to the second round, this was potentially a huge boost for the far right. Why is that? It's because they could reasonably expect to beat in a lot of constituencies the other 2 blocks. So they could reasonably expect to beat the left and to beat Macron's allies, Macron and his allies. So that's why some of the polls early on had the RN maybe getting an overall majority, is that it was possible that they would get 35% of the votes versus 30% for the others. Right, that adds up to 95. But you kind of get my drift. Like they only needed to beat the other 2 in the second round. But what the political parties in France did, and this is quite common, it's happened many times in the past, is they created this kind of Republican front. So they decided to withdraw their candidates when they came third in many constituencies, hundreds. I think it was over 200 constituencies where a third candidate qualified for the second round, but withdrew between the 2 rounds. So that meant that essentially you turn a 3-person race into a 2-person race, and then it's much harder for the RN to get over 50%. So they could have gotten over 33%, over a third, quite easily in many constituencies, but getting over 50 was much, much harder. So that's why the result was ultimately quite poor for the RN, is that the Republican front held. Right? It did what it was designed to do, which is to keep the far right out of power. Now, it didn't work that well because in the past, it could work so that the RN would get 0 seats or 1 or 2 maybe, like in very key constituencies. But this time, I forget the last number because it also depends on how you count the allies, but it's something like 140 if you count the allies. So that's a huge rise for the far right. And this is kind of the untold of the election when we say, oh, the left has won. The left hasn't really won. I mean, the left came first out of 3 blocks, but no bloc has a majority, and the far right got more seats, right, compared with 2022, where they had 89 seats, I believe. So they grew. It's just that they were predicted to have a landslide victory, and they didn't get it. So from the perspective of the media, from the news of last week, it looks like they lost. But actually, from the reality of the National Assembly, they have won seats, right? So they have progressed and they have gained seats. So we can't really call it a defeat for the far right. The one person who has lost is Macron, right? Because his alliance, even though they benefited from a lot of votes from the left, right? The left candidates withdrew. That means a lot of people on the left voted for Macron's candidate in the second round. So they have benefited from the votes of the left. They still lost 95 seats. And so that's a huge, huge decline for Macron's allies. And so these are the real losers of the election, but there's no clear winner. So out of the left that has progressed a little bit, and out of the far right that has progressed by quite a bit, who's really won out of those two? If you have to pick one of the 3 factions, it's not clear. And even the Macron camp, they're claiming that they've kind of won at the moment, right? So that's their talking points, is no one has won, which is kind of true. But then they're saying, but that means we have won, because ultimately, it could have been worse. The polls, for example, that had very early on, before the candidates withdrew between the 2 rounds, the polls that had the far right winning an absolute majority in the assembly, they were predicting that Macron's party would be almost wiped out from the assembly. We're talking like from 250 MPs to 40, right? Those were what the polls were predicting. So that didn't happen, obviously, but because they were saved by the left. So Macron could have been, and his party could have been completely wiped out from the assembly, but the left helped them against the far right. And now the Macron candidates are saying, we will never take part in a government with the left, even though the electors of the left saved them from the far right. It's a very difficult position where you have 3 blocs that are refusing to work together because they have very strong ideological differences. And yet 2 of those blocs have largely benefited from working together between the 2 rounds of the election. So that's the complicated system that France has at the moment, even though on paper it looks very much like the British system, much closer than, let's say, Germany, where there's at least a proportional representation element to the voting. France is much more like the UK, but actually in practice it works very differently.
And that wraps up part 1 of our special series on the French elections with Dr. Charles Devellennes. We've explored Emmanuel Macron's presidency, his media relationships, and the French electoral system.
Join us in part 2, where we'll look at the broader political landscape, the future role of the National Rally, and Macron's economic vision for France. We'll also discuss the implications of the election results for the UK and the EU. Stay tuned for more on the Political Dispatch.